So good morning, and thanks again for joining us for the presentation today that will focus on our collaborative research project called Amplifying the Voices of Black Families and Educators in Nova Scotia, Challenging Anti-Black Racism in Early Childhood Environments. So I'm Jessie Lee McIsaac, and I'm a Tier 2 Canada Research Chair in Early Childhood, Diversity and Transitions at Mount St. Vincent University. I'm cross-appointed in the Faculty of Education and the Department of Child and Youth Study. And in this project, I collaborated with colleagues Dr. Barb Hamilton-Hinch, who works with Dalhousie University and leads the On These Shoulders research collaborative at Dalhousie, and also Crystal Watson, who is a PhD and health student at Dalhousie University. My team at the Early Childhood Collaborative Research Center included Emma Sterling-Cameron, Melina Pimentel, and Nicholas Hickens. So today, Nicholas and I will be sharing our work with you all through this presentation, which will also include a discussion period at the end where we will get into some breakout groups to discuss the work and actions moving forward in early childhood. So before I begin, I do want to first start by acknowledging the land in which we are gathered. Our work in early childhood education is located in Mi'kma'ki, the ancestral and unceded territory of the Mi'kmaq people. This territory is covered by the Treaties of Peace and Friendship, which the Mi'kmaq Maliseet people first signed with the British Crown in 1726. The treaties do not deal with surrender of lands and resources, but recognize the Mi'kmaq and Maliseet titles and establish the rules for what was to be an ongoing relationship between nations. And I would also like to take some time to pay respects to the histories, contributions, and legacies of African Nova Scotian communities that have been here for over 400 years, and the 52 African Nova Scotian communities throughout our region today. So this research that we're going to be talking about was funded by the Inter-University Research Network, which is actually at the Nova Scotia Department of Education and Early Childhood Development, which aims to support local research in Nova Scotia, looking at the student achievement and the gap, and looking at effective strategies to close the achievement gap. So we're actually framing our work not as an achievement gap, but as an opportunity gap that exists in the early childhood period, and that impacts the overall well-being of a child and their access to supports for learning, recreation, and play. And we feel the opportunity gap better represents the problem that's within the system that are creating this gap for children, rather than the emphasis being on the child themselves. We have local evidence of the existence of this gap from some earlier work that was also funded by the IURN. So in an earlier project, we looked at the early development instrument, or the EDI, which is collected at school entry, which told us that children of African ancestry in Nova Scotia are more likely to be vulnerable in developmental expectations at school entry. We also know that this gap continues into their experiences within the school system, with Black children being more likely not to meet the expectations in numeracy and literacy. This gap is further outlined in the recent One Chance to Be a Child report from the Healthy Populations Institute, which I really recommend you all take a look at. My colleague, Dr. Barb Hamilton-Hinch, wrote a spotlight section on the well-being of African Nova Scotian children and youth, which further elaborates on the implications of this opportunity gap among our education and healthcare system. But there's been much less research on the opportunity gap in early learning and childcare settings. So with the Canada-wide early learning and childcare agreements, it's really an important time right now to be thinking about the racial disparities that exist within early childhood that contribute to this gap among Black children. We need to carefully consider what an inclusive, high quality, and culturally responsive childcare system looks like for Black educators, children, and their families. So the focus of our research was to understand the experiences of early childhood educators and parents in Nova Scotia who have and care for young Black children through 3 areas. So we were curious about how Black children in Nova Scotia experience and access play, including a focus on risky and outdoor play, which is an area of interest of Crystal Watson and her PhD research. We were also interested in how racism and discrimination are experienced by Black children and families in Nova Scotia during the early years. And then finally, a specific focus on early learning in childcare settings and experiences within these. So we used a theory called critical race theory in the work, and I'm going to take some time just to explain what we mean by that. Critical race theory was developed by Black and African American scholars in the mid-1970s to uncover and identify manifestations of racism within public systems. So critical race theory, or CRT, is a conceptual framework that can be used as a lens for researchers working with race-based data. By looking at the principles of CRT, this can help us to dig deeper into data, taking a critical approach when we're thinking and learning about experiences. So we further used Black critical theory to hone in on specifically anti-Black racism. So for example, CRT sheds light on laws, policies, and practices within educational or early learning settings that are considered unbiased and in fact standards of whiteness and Western European ideals, such as numeracy and literacy achievements. So specifically, we used 5 key tenets of both CRT and Black critical theory to shape our work. So first, racism, and more specifically anti-Black racism, is endemic and foundational within all social, economic, historical, and cultural spaces, and dimensions critical to identify where and how this is presenting and working. 2, we talk to those with lived experience and recognize the power of storytelling. 3, scholars, and that was us in this context, really had a backdrop of fighting for equity and addressing prevailing narratives of colorblindness. We also thought about the experiences from people who have been marginalized and really privileging those experiences to listen and hear from those. And then finally, our efforts being committed to social justice and action. And this presentation is part of our commitment to that. So what did we do? So we interviewed parents of Black children and early childhood educators that were either Black or that had worked in African Nova Scotian communities. And we did this last summer in 2021. So much like most research, we were delayed by a year with the pandemic, but we were really excited to do this work. Most of our interviews were conducted virtually with, I think, 1 or 2 in person. So we recruited our participants through social media, which we have a pretty good practice of doing. We also looked at family resource centers and other community partners that helped us recruit participants. And this slide here provides an overview of our participants. So we were interested in speaking to parents that had a child with experience in a childcare center, family day home, or pre-primary program. So altogether, we had 7 parents of Black children that were aged 18 months to 5 years old. You can see there that the slide presents their racial identity, their location. So the majority of our parents were located in the broader HRM, with one being in Preston Township. For our ECEs, we had 8 of those that worked in African Nova Scotian communities, and we did have about half that identified as Black or of African descent, and 4 who identified as white. And you can see in our sample, which is probably not a surprise to many of you, the majority of our sample were mothers, and the ECEs identified as women. So we're going to share the results now. I'm going to start by presenting a couple of slides, and then I'll pass it off to Nicholas, who will share the rest. And we've organized the results through the 3 study objectives. So the first focus is relevant to you all, looking at Black families and ECEs and their experiences within early childhood settings. So we had 3 themes that I'll go through, and I'll illustrate some of those experiences through the quotes that are on the slide. The first thing that we heard from our participants was the mainstream approach to curriculum that was very prevalent. So parents and ECEs noted the pervasiveness of white norms within early childhood settings, such as things that occur through the curriculum and programming within programs. Black ECEs discussed the challenges they encountered when looking at incorporating an Afrocentric approach in their programs. And parents expressed the desires for curriculum and programming that allowed their children to embrace and celebrate their Black identity. So this quote here speaks from the perspective of an ECE and the challenges of incorporating their lens within an early childhood setting. A second theme within this area of the work looked at the lack of responsiveness to racism, social justice, and equity. So ECEs and parents almost all indicated a specific incidence that they witnessed of racism amongst Black children. And white ECEs indicated a real feeling of unpreparedness in addressing those issues within their programs. ECEs and parents discussed how programs responded sometimes and sometimes not in the fullest extent to current issues in social justice, so such as the discovery of Indigenous children's remains in George Floyd murder. They talked about those things that were happening in the moment. Again, this was in 2021, so when there was a lot of discussion happening at the time, and sometimes the limited ability to do something and to really incorporate information about this in their programs. ECEs and parents reported also the lack of acknowledgement of cultural and heritage celebrations, such as African Heritage Months. So this ECE is commenting specifically on the discovery of Indigenous remains and also the George Floyd murder and just the lack of action that was occurring at this time. That was a really important time to think about how they might be able to do this in a developmentally appropriate way with children in their programs. And then the final theme in this area was a feeling of an absence of cultural safety. So parents and ECEs reflected on diversity and sometimes the lack of diversity in early learning and childcare settings, and often linked and talked about the importance of representation in programs connected to children's sense of belonging. So parents discussed stigmas and stereotypes, especially in the context of hair, and the things that they encountered within childcare settings. And the quote on the slide is an example of an experience of a parent where, and really an illustration of how they felt their child was being treated differently from their peers, from something like biting, which, developmentally expected at certain times, and their feelings of being reprimanded differently from the white children in the classroom. So Nicholas, I'll pass it on to you.
Thank you, Jessica. So outdoor play was also a significant part of our study, especially among Black children. Outdoor play generally plays a critical role in the early years of our development, as exposure to new stimuli is critical for neural development. And many of the families in ECE spoke fondly about their own experiences that they've had as younger children and alongside their new children. And this also reflected some of their new experience that they have had in their new roles as parents and educators. And as you can tell, a lot of these experiences were quite intangible to a lot of them. The first quote was from a parent who illustrated how much she loved seeing her son get dirty in play. And it was a critical memory that just stuck with her and resonated, which really provided a positive impact on their overall outlook. It also reflected the fact that before, as many of them had noted, really embraced the idea of having unsupervised free play that was normally a foundational part of Black communities. However, what we are also noticing from a lot of our participants was that there is an increasing level of over-policing and surveillance that remain rampant in a lot of these communities. And as a result, there's a accumulated fear that many of these families can face, especially when it relates to risky play, because we're also often a target for potential issues when it comes to the medical system and child protective services that typically over-surveil Black children more than their counterparts. You can go to the next slide. Thank you. Also, there's a lot of limited opportunities in historically African Nova Scotian communities to engage in play. And this is largely attributed to the lack of developmental opportunities in urban planning. You've perhaps heard of the concept of spatialized justice, where there's a lack of actual safety provisions such as sidewalks and speed limits, reliable transportation, recreational centers and parks that in many communities are normalized and actually a paramount part of the daily lives of children. Yet for many African Nova Scotian communities, this is not a set default. And we can see that in one of our examples here by another parent who's terrified of potentially her child being injured because of the lack of safety that is within those neighborhoods as well, including busy traffic and other risk factors that can potentially put their child in danger. Next, we also looked at Black families and their familial experiences, which were all pivotal to their African Nova Scotian children and Black children in general. Many of the parents expressed the intergenerational cycle of racism and the trauma that's associated with it, which can really create a level of a negative self-perception, value, and self-efficacy. Many of them noted that they were expressing levels of fear as to the level of racism and discrimination that can be passed on to their children as well, as they've also faced it at some point in their lives. And they felt that within some of these systems that have already been established, that they may face a level of injustice and discrimination, just as their families and other generations have faced. And when we talk about this, we're really trying to tie the concept of what racial infrastructure is, where there is a level of implicit biases and other normalized aspects that are ingrained into the system. So we're talking about issues of overt hate speech, racially abusive language, and over-punishment or racial profiling that's almost become commonplace within a lot of these settings. So it's really recognizing that these environments are not conducive to the unique needs of Black children who are not often represented in a positive light. So to combat this, a lot of parents did feel the need to support their children by bolstering their self-confidence and just a sense of Black pride. So this means really developing a positive self-concept through representation, embracing diversity through their histories, and also making sure that their culture is also put at a paramount level. Parents also promoted and resisted a lot of these normalized aspects, such as normalizing whiteness, and try to promote a level of inclusivity in safe spaces where their children can truly be represented and heard. So some key takeaways. So just relating back to what I had mentioned before about developing a positive self-concept and value, it's really important that we begin to really understand the level of impact that racial discrimination, stereotyping, and stigma can have over one's sense of identity and autonomy. Also knowing that the generational trauma and cycle that remains prevalent among a lot of Black families and communities during the early childhood period really plays a pivotal role in their overall self-value and maintaining that level of efficacy and preventing a sense of learned helplessness. Inequitable opportunities to engage in outdoor play is also pervasive, but it ties back to the fact that there's a disproportionate lack of resources that are allocated towards the development of Black, historically Black communities, for example, which creates a lack of development. So Some early learning childhood centers also face a lack of cultural sensitivity, which can be shown through the level of programming, representative figures, and other images where the experiences of Black families and communities can be transparent and visible. Many mainstream approaches so far are still based on experiences that are normalized within white settings, for example, and this can be largely attributed to infrastructure that are already preset, and as a result, it really ignores the socioeconomic factors and racial disparities that are evident among Black children within early learning and childcare systems. As you perhaps have heard from Jessie Lee, that there is an opportunity gap that is pervasive within these areas, and it's something that really needs to be revamped. The lack of universal procedures and informed interventions in childcare centers are also needed. And this is pivotal because of issues of racism and discrimination, where there is not a set procedure that's put in place to address such issues. So there are some actionable steps that can be taken through policy. And first, I think it's important to recognize that we must first acknowledge and really value the experiences of Black families and really incorporating that into informing equitable systems. And this means really providing a platform to voice challenges that are commonplace in Black neighborhoods and taking a proactive approach towards supporting those communities, which can be done through funding and other initiatives as well. And coming back to the whole concept of a lack of infrastructure, we really need to consider urban planning and making sure that any provisions that are made are done in a culturally sensitive manner, where culturally appropriate environments can be facilitated to empower Black children. We also need a level of professional development, and this is not a set standard. It needs to be something that is continuous as well, that really incorporates the cultural and theoretical foundations of a lot of the things that we've been highlighting today, and really fostering a diverse network and workforce within the early childcare setting is really crucial as well. So some of the programs that are currently out, such as supporting Black ECEs, are also necessary to ensure that we have diverse programming. Okay, so thank you all kindly for listening. I know it's a lot of information to take in right now, but I'll pass this on to Jessie Lee, and hopefully we can have some more fruitful conversations.